History 1. I'm a long-haul trucker named Joe, and I see and deal with a lot of weird and scary stuff out on the road. One night I was traveling up US 93 in Nevada, heading to Portland for a delivery. It was around 1:30 in the morning and I needed to stop and log my half-hour break. I found a wide spot and pulled off. After logging my break, I made myself a sandwich. While I was eating, I noticed a vehicle pulling up behind me. I didn't get too concerned at first, but I kept one eye on it while I ate. Then things started to get strange. I noticed a figure in the headlights of the vehicle approaching the back driver's side of my trailer. The person stopped and looked like they were rubbing the back or side of my trailer with their hand. That seemed suspicious for sure. I got my pistol out of my lockbox, cocked it, loaded it, and slid it behind my waistband. Then I climbed out of my rig. Walking about 10 feet back, I kept my hand on the butt of the pistol and turned my flashlight on, aiming it at the person. It was a man, a weird-looking fellow in a dirty whitish trench coat, with long, straggly hair and bald on top. He was rubbing something on the side of my trailer. I hollered at him to stop what he was doing. He looked up at me and smirked. Without turning his gaze off me, he started walking toward me. I backed my way to the door, keeping my hand on the pistol, but not pulling it out yet. I didn't feel like my life was in danger at that moment. I opened up my door and climbed back into my rig, shutting and locking the door. The dude walked up to my door, still smirking. This dude is off his rocker, I thought. My half-hour break was definitely over and it was time to go. However, as I looked down at him, getting ready to turn the key, I felt my truck rock. I jumped and looked at my driver's side mirror. Nothing. I checked my passenger side mirror, and there on my step, face pressed to my passenger side window, was a freaky, perfect replica of an old witch. She was smiling with rotten teeth, cocking her head left and then right, fogging up my window. Needless to say, I was about to suck my seat up my ass, and that wasn't the end of it. Oh no. The dude then jumped up on my driver's side step and proceeded to start licking my window. The witch lady started smacking my window with the palm of her hand over and over. Then the dude started telling me to open up my door. "Hey boy, open up, come on now, open up, we're friendly. What you got in this trailer of yours, anything good? Open up, boy." Now I felt threatened. I pulled my pistol out and the chick immediately disappeared off my passenger side step. The dude laughed, then jumped down and off my step, just grinning. He touched his fingers to his nose, then jumped off my step again. I fired my truck up and took off like a bat out of hell. Never did see any headlights following me, thank God. So, to those disturbing travelers, yeah, let's not meet again. History 2. This was a long time ago, so the timeline might be a bit off and the details are fuzzy, but I'll write it out exactly as I recall. In the early 2000s, my family was living in Europe, and in December of 2001, we were heading back home to Latin America for a Christmas vacation. My brother Tom and I, along with our dad, were flying together from Paris to Miami. Dad was seated in business class while Tom and I were in coach, sitting in the middle two seats of the middle row. The flight started pretty normal, with nothing out of the ordinary. About 4 or 5 hours into the flight, I was reading a book, almost dozing off, when I heard a woman start to repeat the word "no" over and over. At first it was quiet, almost inaudible, but it quickly got very loud and urgent. Before I realized what was happening, she was screaming "no, no, no" at the top of her lungs. I looked up and saw a flight attendant a few rows ahead of me to the right, hunched over someone sitting in the window seat. My first thought was that the passenger was having a heart attack or some catastrophic health problem, but her yelling was so unsettling that it couldn't be that simple. There was a strange, long delay in people's reactions. Nobody did anything. I completely panicked and froze in my seat. Tom, on the other hand, jumped out of his seat, leaped over the person sitting next to him, and ran up to see what was going on. He was up there in a matter of seconds, and as he approached, suddenly everyone around us stood up to see what was happening or to try to help. The woman kept screaming over and over, struggling with this passenger. He was really tall, so tall that his whole head was visible over the back of the seat. He had very long black curly hair. Tom came back to our row and said, "Something is wrong," before going back up to get a closer look. Passengers close to the woman began struggling with the guy as well. A bunch of people jumped on him and started pulling at him. Someone in the row behind him even pulled his hair back so hard that his face jerked towards the top of the plane. He let out a really loud moan or scream, and then it was chaos. The aisles were so crowded that nobody could move, and I saw a fire extinguisher being passed hand to hand from the back of the plane. I immediately thought there was a fire, and that we were all going to die. It was an incredibly hopeless sensation to know there was nowhere to run and no way to escape the situation unfolding right in front of you. They passed the extinguisher all the way up to a male flight attendant near the guy. The flight attendant hit him with the butt of the extinguisher really hard on the face. They started asking for belts, headphone straps, anything they could use to restrain him. Tom took off his belt and gave it to them. They wrapped everything they could around the passenger's arms, shoulders, and torso, securing him to the seat. I saw the male flight attendant who had hit him with the fire extinguisher carry a large black tennis shoe to the back of the plane. At the time, it seemed kind of strange, and I didn't think much of it. The flight attendants asked if there was a doctor on board to sedate the man. People kept asking if there was a flight marshal on board too, but nobody came forward. I can't remember exactly how or when things calmed down, but eventually everyone was told to return to their seats. A small group of people who had helped restrain the man were asked to keep guard on a rotation. There were always at least a few people sitting behind him or next to him, keeping an eye on him the entire time. I think there was even someone behind him holding a fistful of his hair for the rest of the flight. The pilot announced over the PA system that there had been a security breach. I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was vague, and we were being diverted to Boston Logan Airport. He said they didn't know if the person was working alone, so we should get to know our neighbors. We were in the middle of the Atlantic with maybe 4 more hours to go before we landed. Things were a bit ominous and tense, but for the most part, everyone was friendly and in a pretty good mood. Nobody really knew exactly what had happened. We weren't allowed to get up from our seats. If you had to use the bathroom, you needed to call a flight attendant to escort you, and you weren't allowed to lock the door either. I remember a grumpy old man a few rows from us who got really annoyed after a while and kept getting up without permission just to annoy the flight attendants. They were not happy. After a while, they put on the movie Legally Blonde to distract everyone. Tom and I went up to business class to talk to Dad. Apparently, they didn't hear the extent of the chaos back in coach. They were all going about business as usual. A few hours later, as we approached the U.S., we saw fighter jets outside the windows on both sides of the plane. The pilot announced that they were escorting us back to Boston. A few little kids got really excited watching those jets. I learned later that these jets were a last resort security measure to prevent hijacked planes from repeating 9/11-style attacks. They were supposed to shoot us down in case of a major threat. We landed and were told to stay seated. A SWAT team came on board, carrying assault rifles and wearing a ton of body armor. They cut off all the guy's restraints and took him off the plane. I saw everything in detail since we were seated only a few seats behind him. We were parked in the middle of the tarmac for a long time before we were allowed to disembark. I remember seeing pieces of Tom's belt on the guy's seat as we left and thought about taking one as a souvenir, but I decided against it. We were escorted to a baggage claim area in Boston Logan Airport that was surrounded by a large metal fence to keep us all in one place. We were there for what felt like 3 or 4 hours, just waiting anxiously. No one would explain anything to us. Passengers were getting really agitated, shaking the metal fences and yelling at the airport personnel that this was inhumane treatment. There was no food, nowhere to sit, and children were crying. Dozens of people were trying to sleep on the baggage carousels. They finally ordered a bunch of pizzas and led us into the waiting area with actual chairs, where each passenger was interrogated by the FBI. They were astonishingly unfriendly. I guess they were trying to discern if the guy had any partners on board. They then shuttled us back to our baggage, where security officers thoroughly hand-searched every single suitcase and carry-on bag, and then patted everyone down. We were finally allowed to make a phone call, and I called my mom. The rest of the family was completely hysterical. They had been watching the news all day and knew that an Islamic extremist had tried to blow up our flight with a bomb that he'd smuggled on board inside his shoe. We had absolutely no idea what had really happened until that moment, as we were kept completely in the dark. It was a very strange sensation. Up until this point, Dad, Tom, and I had actually remained pretty relaxed considering the circumstances. We were more annoyed about the inconvenient changes to our travel itinerary and the crazy experience on that plane. We had no idea how bad the security breach really was, how close we came to being killed. After about 12 hours in Boston, we were put on another flight home. Tom made the mistake of giving a few interviews to CNN and other networks while we were in Boston. So when we landed in our small country, he was immediately swarmed by the press and gave a bunch of interviews despite being exhausted. I was happy to finally sit and relax with my family after the longest and most stressful trip of my life. We later learned that the bomber, Richard Reed, had actually tried to board the same flight on the previous day. He was detained and questioned by French security because of multiple red flags. He had no luggage and had purchased a one-way ticket with cash, causing him to miss the flight. They put him on the next day's flight and put him up in a hotel far from the airport since everything nearby was booked. The following day, it rained, and on the walk from the hotel to the airport, his shoes got wet. This might have been why he had trouble lighting the wick that was inside his shoe, which he was planning to light mid-flight. He waited until the passenger next to him went to the bathroom, then tried to light his shoe with matches. The female flight attendant who first engaged him had smelled the matches and was walking up and down the aisle looking for a passenger who she assumed was trying to smoke a cigarette. She saw him with a shoe in his lap and immediately tried to take it from him. They struggled, and he bit her hand. Reed is now serving 3 life terms in prison. History 3. I'm not really sure how to begin this, but my story might make more sense after you read it. I'll try to be as clear as I can. It was the summer of 2004. My family was supposed to vacation in Kennebunkport, Maine. My father, Jim, was stuck in meetings, so he was going to come up from Manhattan a few days after us. My mother, Mary, wanted to drive up, which super annoyed me at the time, but we didn't have much of a choice. So my brother Tom, my sister Lisa, and I loaded up into the car and started that drive. I was about 14 at the time. The drive itself was uneventful, but there were various delays, and we ended up getting there a lot later than we originally planned. Because of this, the owners of the house we were renting had turned in for the night, and we weren't able to get a hold of them to get the keys to get inside. Sounds like horrible planning, but apparently they were pretty strict about the time frame to pick up the keys. My mom, who was unfazed, decided that she wanted lobster, so we all went to one of her favorite spots. She called my dad to see if he could make reservations at a hotel in Kennebunkport from New York while we ate. We were just enjoying the lobster when a guy came up and started chatting with my mom. I figured it was just a friendly local making conversation. During this, my dad called my mom. My mom excused herself to speak to him. Apparently all the hotels were booked for the night. Go figure, high vacation season in Kennebunkport. The plan was for us to drive to the nearest town and just find somewhere to stay until we could pick up the keys for our vacation home. Apparently that local had been listening to my mom's conversation and came back over once she got off the phone. I want to say first that there was nothing outwardly off about this guy. He was preppy, clean-cut, unassuming, and fit in with the clientele. He told my mom that he had a big home with a big guest house, and we were more than welcome to stay with him and his wife. He said she wouldn't mind. Immediately my reaction was like, no way in the world I am staying at a random dude's house in creepy Maine in the dark. My mom, doing her due diligence, determined that this guy was legit. He said he was in finance, and my mom was an investment banker. They chatted long enough for my mom to determine that he wasn't totally full of it. I called my dad hysterical. He said that I was overreacting and that I needed to get out of the city more and just accept that sometimes people are just nice. So my brother, sister, and I got into our car and followed this man back to his house. The guest house was really nice, fully furnished, but the beds were oddly placed. The guest house had 2 bedrooms, and instead of the beds being located in the middle or center, they were right under each window. It just seemed out of place. So anyway, fast forward. We're all getting ready for bed, and my mom hears a knock on the door. It's that guy. He said he just wanted to check to make sure we got all settled in. Cool, nice thing to do, I guess. Then about 30 minutes later, he comes back to check in again. At this point, my mom was like, "Thanks, we're good. We'll stop by the house in the morning just to say thank you, etc." Fast forward another 30 to 45 minutes. I can't sleep. Terrified, we hear this rustling, which is odd because the guest house was nowhere near any trees or even close to bushes that might cause such a noise. At this point, I see my mom wide awake, looking up out the window, motioning towards the window with her eyes. Let me add, none of the windows had curtains. The guy said it was because his wife was in the process of redecorating. When I looked up, there was a male figure just standing there. I thought I was going to have a heart attack. I don't know how long he was standing there for. When he walked away, my mom waited a bit and told us to get our stuff together. She wasn't messing around. We had my dad on the phone at this point. He was pretty much flipping out at my mom about something, but I didn't hear what. My mom said she was going to go put the stuff in the car and told us to follow her out. This was all around 2 a.m. We got into the car and pulled around to the front of the main house so my mom could return the key, say thanks, and just get out of there. However, when we got to the front, all the lights were off. Not just all the lights, but it looked like no one had been home. Porch light, table lamp in the front windows, everything was dark. Also, the 2 cars were gone, including what we had presumed to be his wife's car. After seeing this, my mom was pretty unsettled. She said that we were just going to leave and proceeded to drive to the gate. The gate at the end of the driveway had been deadbolted and padlocked shut from the inside. It wasn't a super strong gate, so my dad just told her to rev it. Thankfully, we were in a big SUV and just got out of there. We drove straight back to New York City, not speaking the entire time, and we have never returned to Maine. My parents still refuse to speak about it to this day. I ended up asking a family member about it one night when he was drunk, and he said, "Oh, they didn't tell you. The actual owners of that house were on vacation." I'm assuming my mom or dad followed up with one of the local authorities and figured that out but never told us. I don't know who that man was or what he was planning that evening. I was curious as to whether there were any known serial killers or murderers who were in that area at the time, whether traveling through or whatever. History 4. For the record, I'm a man named Bill, and this story happened when I was about 15 years old. Now, I'm turning 19 this year. I'm from a small town in the Midwest, so my English should be fine. When I was 15, I had just started my junior year and created my first Twitter account, which I later deleted because of what happened. I didn't tell anyone my username, not my family nor my friends. I didn't really have any friends anyway. My profile picture was just an avatar. No photos of me on that account. In the location I said Springfield because I lived in a nearby suburb. I didn't have many followers, maybe 20 or 30. I didn't know many people, so it wasn't very interesting. One evening in October, I received a strange direct message. It was from someone with 200 followers, and the message said, "Hi, my name is Jake. I just turned 17 and wanted to know if you lived in the area because I'll soon be moving there and going to the local high school. I'm looking for friends." Immediately, I thought something was off because nowhere on my profile did it say where I actually lived. After some thought, I remembered a tweet I made weeks ago about buses, and I mentioned the city. So I figured he must have looked up the town and found my tweet. His age wasn't shocking since I was a couple of years ahead of my classmates. I was bored, and he seemed polite, so I responded and told him I did live in that town and went to that high school. The conversation flowed naturally. We talked a lot that night about high school, the cafeteria food, teachers, stuff like that. It was getting late, though, and he started asking some personal questions like, "Do you live far from the school? Are you in a house or an apartment? Do you live with both parents? Are you often home alone?" I didn't answer because it felt too shady, and fortunately, he didn't insist. If he had, I probably would have blocked him. The next day we talked again and he kept asking all kinds of personal questions to get to know me better. I ended up asking some questions too, and he always answered what seemed like honestly. I still avoided answering questions about my house because he didn't need to know that. This went on for 2 or 3 weeks. and in that time I developed feelings for him. He was handsome, super kind, and it was everything I needed since IVDJTMD'd been bullied for years. Even today, I still develop strong feelings and blind trust in people who are just friendly to me. In October, we have a 2-week vacation in France, and the day before we went back to school, he told me he was coming to my neighborhood since he finally moved in with his mom. He asked me to meet him during the morning break. I was so happy and relieved to finally meet him. I told him to join me in the hall, but when he realized there would be people around, he said he preferred to meet in an isolated place because he was afraid he wouldn't recognize me and didn't want to spend the break looking for me. It was a good enough excuse for me, so I told him to meet me in the 3rd-floor bathroom. We weren't allowed to stay there during breaks, so no one would disturb us. It seemed a bit creepy, but I thought being in school meant nothing could happen to me. The next day I dressed nicely, wore my best clothes, and counted down the minutes until break time. When it finally arrived, I ran to the bathroom and waited. He arrived, and it was him. He wasn't a catfish. He looked like his profile picture, but I noticed he seemed a lot older, like 20 instead of 17. We talked a lot, got along well, and I was pleased. At the end of the break, he asked me to go to a fast food place for lunch. I said no because I didn't have any money, and refused to let people pay for me out of principle. He seemed disappointed, but offered to walk me home after classes. I explained I had to take the bus, but said he could walk me to the bus stop. He looked disappointed again, but accepted. That's how it went for a while. We met in the 3rd-floor bathroom during morning breaks, and he walked me to the bus stop after classes. Oddly, I never saw him in the hallways or cafeteria, but with over 1,500 students and our schedules not coinciding, I figured it was possible. This continued until December, almost a month and a half. On December 14th, a Thursday, I mentioned how lonely I'd be that evening because my dad was abroad for work. My brother was always at his friend's house. My little sister was on a school trip, and my mom had to work late. It was reckless of me, but after weeks I thought I could trust him. That evening, he walked me to the bus stop. We waited. I got on the bus, waved at him, and put on my earphones. I had 2 stops before my house, and it was around 5:45 p.m. in December, so it was already dark. As I got off the bus, I had a really bad feeling, like I was being watched. I paused my music but kept my earphones in so people would think I couldn't be DJTM'd hear anything. That probably saved my life. I live in a suburban neighborhood, very quiet, especially at night. I heard footsteps behind me and realized someone was following me. He wasn't trying to catch up, just keeping pace. Quietly, I reached for my keys. When I got them out, I ran the fastest I ever had. Somehow I managed to open and close the door before he reached me. Inside, I deactivated the alarm, confirming I was home alone. I looked through the glass panel on the door. VDJTM's a whole window, so anyone could see inside. It was Jake, a few meters away, looking at me with a creepy expression. He had followed me home, probably by car, and was clearly not there for a friendly chat. I don't know why I didn't VJTM to call the police. I was paralyzed. We stared at each other for a minute. When I regained control, I ran to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and went to the back door. He was there too, banging on it. I feared the glass would break, but it didn't. Those moments, pushing against the door, praying it wouldn't break, while he kicked harder and harder, were the longest of my life. After maybe 5 minutes, he stopped and went around the house, knocking on every shutter, then returned to the front door. He looked very angry, but then my neighbor VDJTM's car pulled up, and Jake ran away, probably thinking it was my mom. The next day, Jake sent me countless messages before I blocked him, then deleted his account. I thought it was over, but soon after, new accounts followed me, all with usernames of random numbers and the first letter of his name. I blocked each one, but another would follow. It was too much, so I deleted my account. It was hard to endure those dozens of insulting DMs. Later, I talked to people who were supposedly Jake VJTM's classmates, but none had ever heard of him. He was never a student at my high school. That VDJTM is why I never saw him apart from our meetings. And that TMM's probably why he seemed so old. I never heard from him again, and I still wonder what he wanted and what could have happened that night if he had gotten inside. History 5. I used to work on the North Slope of Alaska in the oil industry. The work we did required us to travel far out into the Alaskan Petroleum Reserve, which is basically just untamed tundra wilderness for hundreds of miles. The oil companies would build these long, icy roads in the winter that would lead to drilling pads. Our job was to go out after they finished the initial drilling and test rock formations for their oil-producing qualities. It was mid-January, and the sun hadn't come up yet. When I say the sun hadn't come up, I mean it had been almost a month and a half of polar nights. The particular well site we were traveling to was about 60 miles west of Alpine, Alaska, deep inside the wilderness. Our job took a week, but we finished and were headed back to camp to complete our hitch and go home. At the beginning and end of the icy roads, there are guard shacks where you have to check in and out for safety. There's no cell reception, and radios only work up to a certain distance. If you don't check in or out at a set time, they come looking for you to ensure you're not a popsicle. It was about 4 in the morning. Not that it really mattered in the land of endless night, and we were halfway across the ice road. Travel was slow, as the speed limit on those roads is only 25 miles per hour. Then something appeared on the road in our headlights. It was a man in jeans, sneakers, and a hoodie, walking down an ice road in the wilderness tundra at 4 a.m. in negative 20 degrees. It's not unusual for the local Inuit people to be out this far hunting. Maybe his snowmobile broke down, and he was trying to get back to the guard shack. Seemed plausible. He didn't acknowledge us as our truck rolled up next to him. He just kept shuffling forward. He didn't seem cold, and his clothing, while totally inappropriate for this extreme weather, appeared warm and dry. We also noticed he was Inuit but Caucasian. I rolled down my window and asked if he needed any help and if he was okay. He didn't acknowledge us and kept shuffling forward. His face was completely blank, devoid of any thought or emotion. The other guys in my truck suggested he might have been in an accident and was still in shock. I continued rolling my truck alongside him as he trudged down the road, still trying to get his attention. In the extreme cold, I occasionally got whiffs of a peculiar smell coming off him. He smelled acidic, if that makes any sense. There was just a lot about this guy that made the hair on my neck stand up. The guy behind me in the truck's crew cab had enough of this. He rolled down his window and reached out to grab the guy. He later said he was going to try and shake him out of his stupor. Before my buddy's hand could reach him, this walking popsicle spun around and latched onto my buddy's outstretched arm. He glared at my buddy, then at me, with a look of pure rage, not removing his hand from my buddy VJTM's arm. If emotions had a physical temperature, this guy could have melted the entire tundra that night. My buddy groaned out in pain, trying to get his arm free. At that moment, the guy just started screaming in our faces. There was so much hate and rage and anger in that scream, it was absolutely terrifying. I slammed on the gas and spun out on the ice for a second before the wheels caught and launched us forward. Popsicle Dude still had a hold on my buddy's arm and was trying to pull him out of the truck. He was running alongside the truck while the other guys in the cab held onto my buddy's arm, keeping him inside. After several moments, it could have been only a few seconds, but it felt like forever. My buddy tore free from this guy, and we hauled ass to the guard shack, another 30 miles down the road. We checked in with the guards and reported what we had just seen. The guard looked at us like we were pulling some sort of prank, but policy stated they had to check it out regardless. My buddy's arm was sore, and when he pulled back his sleeve, there were noticeable bruises in the shape of a hand around his arm. We filed the report with the guard and were told to head back to our camp. None of us really wanted to talk about what happened, and it was a quiet drive the rest of the way. We flew home the next day. The next time we saw the guard at his shack, we asked if he ever saw Mr. Popsicle on his patrols. He told us they searched up and down that ice road for a solid 12-hour shift and saw nothing, not even tracks in the snow leading off the road. He told us it was a good prank and that he'd be getting us back for making him waste a shift driving around. But it wasn't a prank. Who would even make up a story like that? Who would willingly bruise their arm for a dumb prank? We never got a satisfying answer to what happened that evening, and I still wonder about that dude, if it even was a dude. The Alaskan tundra is a weird place, and that was just one of my many strange stories from my time up there. I'll work to write down more of my experiences and share them when I can. History 6. My family loves to go on vacation in the Swedish countryside, and my grandmother even has a cottage in the forest that all family members can use if they want. A couple of years ago, when I was around 20, I went on vacation there with my mom and grandma during autumn for about 10 days. This is the Swedish backwoods, and we go there to unwind, enjoy nature, and take a break from civilization hiking, canoeing, foraging for mushrooms, sitting around the fireplace in the evening, that sort of thing. It's not completely isolated. You can find some villages and fields here and there, but it's definitely very rural. You don't have to encounter any people if you don't want to. I've always liked to go exploring on my own, finding new paths through the woods, and updating our old maps to better reflect the current landscape. The maps you can buy of this area haven't been updated in ages, and many paths don't even exist anymore because nature has swallowed them. What I really like is exploring abandoned buildings, and rural Sweden is great for that. Back in the 1800s, many Swedish people in the countryside were dirt poor and starving, so they moved to the New World in search of a better life. You can still find the foundations of old farmhouses, sometimes entire small villages in the woods, often with rusted 100-year-old farm equipment. Like many other countries, Sweden has an issue with rural exodus nowadays. Middle-aged and younger people move to the cities, leaving the old folks behind. When they pass away, nobody buys the house, and it just sits there abandoned. This happens a lot, and you can find many empty houses in the forest. I love sneaking around in them. Most have been looted, presumably by hunters, loggers, or other hikers, but sometimes you can still find interesting things. It's rare to meet anyone out in those woods, so I don't worry about being seen. One crisp autumn day, I took one of our bicycles, a map, GPS isn't really a thing out there, my phone, and some food and drink. I told my mom and grandma I'd be back by nightfall at the latest, and then set out to explore. I chose a wide loop on the map that I guessed would take about 3 hours if the paths were clear and if I didn't stop to explore. Even if I did, I thought I still had plenty of time until dusk. At first, I had a lot of fun, riding the mountain bike down smaller and smaller forest paths, finding some old foundations of buildings and some root cellars that were still intact. I even found some mushrooms. I had some problems with the map, though, because, as I said, many paths on the map don't exist anymore, so I had to turn back a few times. But mostly I had a pretty good idea of where I was. Of course, that made it all take longer than I anticipated. When I reached the furthest point of the loop and turned onto a narrow path that, according to the map, would take me back in an hour, the sun was already pretty low in the sky. I started feeling a bit uneasy. I have to admit I was worried I couldn't trust the map even less than I thought. Also, shortly before turning onto that path, I found some traps in the woods that kind of creeped me out. There were 3 big cages, each with a platform in the middle connected to a steel door on the front. On those platforms were small animal remains, rotten and black, with little bones sticking out, bait that hadn't TMT been touched. I took a stick and deactivated the traps by pushing onto the platform through the cage bars. When those doors snapped shut, it was so loud that I flinched. Afterwards, I noticed how quiet it had become. Now I was clumsily cycling over uneven ground and the sun was setting. I started feeling like everything around me was sort of aware, if that makes any sense. It wasn't the feeling of being watched, not quite yet. It just felt like I had to try and be quiet somehow. After a while, I came upon a crossroad in a more open area, where I was supposed to follow the path straight on. The trees were not so high here, and I guessed this had been one of the clearings created by a severe storm 10 years back. At the crossroads was a tiny wooden building, somewhere between a shed and a cabin. I'd set out to find abandoned houses, and so far, I'd only seen a couple of stone foundations and a root cellar. Even though I should have hurried to get back, curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to check if this thing was locked and see if I could take a peek inside. It wasn't locked, but the door was kind of stuck in the frame. Inside the cabin was a cot, a tiny oven, and a big mass of taxidermy animals. They were even on the cot in the oven, and they were nailed to the ceiling and walls. Almost every inch of the cabin was covered in layer after layer of black mold. It was so much that with some of the animals you couldn't tell what they had once been. With others I could only guess from the shape. They all looked monstrous, covered in that stuff, and the smell of rot and mold was overwhelming. I quickly tried to close the door again, but the wood had warped so much that it wasn't possible. I left it hanging slightly open and got out of there. As I started cycling away from the cabin, I felt strange. This time I did feel like I was being watched. I was nonsensically thinking, "You should have closed the door, you should have closed the door." I didn't know why I thought that, but it made me uneasy to think that the shed was now open. I told myself I was being silly because why would it matter? Obviously no one was using that cabin anymore. Maybe 10 minutes later, the path entered a stretch of older woods with much higher trees. The sun was now close to the horizon, and the sky was full of orange light. Under the fir trees, it was already getting very dark. I checked my phone to maybe tell my mom I might be late, but I still had no reception. A couple more minutes into the dark forest, the path disappeared. At this point, I had two options. Try to push through with my bike until I met a logging road that was hopefully on the other side of the stretch of woods, or return, go past the moldy shed again, and try to get back the way I came. The second option was not an option for me. As I already said, I had to zigzag and improvise to even come this far because the map was wrong in so many places. Going back all the way would take ages, and I could get turned around in the dark and easily lose my way. But also, and really, I did not want to go past that shed again. I had a sudden aversion to even look behind me. As dusk crept through the forest, I was getting properly paranoid. An uneasy feeling crystallized into the idea that I had disturbed something inside there, and because I left the door open, something had now come out of the shed and was following me. I knew the whole thing was stupid, but I couldn't shake that feeling. Going past the shed, past those traps, through the ruins of that old village, past the open mouths of the root cellars in the dark, and getting lost out there with the feeling of something possibly on my trail. No way was I going back that way. Yes, I might get lost trying to go through those woods in front of me. I would have to push and maybe even carry my bike, but the woods didn't seem to stretch too far in front of me, only left and right, so it seemed like the only option. I was just hoping at this point that the supposed logging road on the other side was still there. After tearing through brambles for a bit, I found what I guessed might be the remnants of the old path because the ground was sort of lower there. I tried to follow that until I came upon another set of ruins. Again, the foundations of some farmhouse, presumably. Behind that, the ground sloped down into a marshy area with birches that seemed white in the gloom under the trees. At this point, I stopped to listen, but I still didn't want to turn around. I couldn't didn't hear anything. The ugly feeling of being watched, of being followed, only increased. At this point, I felt like not only was something coming after me, but like the forest itself was aware of my presence, listening maybe, or watching, like it was being deliberately quiet. I was feeling so scared that I didn't even try to talk myself out of this feeling anymore. I just accepted that this was what I was dealing with now. I had some leftover food in my backpack, a sandwich and some sesame snacks, and of course the mushrooms I found earlier. I took all of it out, laid it on a stone on one of the old walls that surrounded the ruins, and said something to the effect of, "Please let me go, I'm really sorry, I won't come back here, I promise, just let me go home." After that, I grabbed my bike and went down to the swamp, still not looking back. Luckily, it turned out it wasn't a large swamp or anything, just a wet patch for about 200 meters until the ground sloped upwards again. Still, it took a while because of the bike, which I had to push and carry by turns because I really couldn't see anymore. I was constantly stepping into muddy pools and getting stuck. When I emerged on the other side, I was soaked in sweat, and my feet were wet and muddy to mid-calf. I still stopped frequently to listen for any sounds behind me, but there was nothing. And then, wouldn't you know it, the trees opened up, and there it was, the logging road. I could have cried with joy and relief in that moment. I stepped onto the road and turned back to look behind me, but I couldn't even see the swamp through the trees anymore. It was almost completely dark at this point. Luckily, there was some moonlight, and the light on the bike still worked. I climbed on my bike and pedaled home as fast as I could. About half an hour later, I even had some cell phone reception for a moment, so I called my mom and told her I got lost. I didn't want her to know how I'd worked myself up into a panic over nothing. She was already worried, but the horrible feeling I had back there, deep in those woods, eased up gradually. I even heard an owl and saw a deer later. By the time I arrived back at our cabin, I was finally feeling okay again, just extremely exhausted. So here's what I think happened. I got worried because I was out in the forest later than I planned, then got spooked by the ugly sight within the cabin. At that point, I basically drove myself into hysteria because of my overactive imagination and my inexperience with the forest at night. There was nothing there that wasn't explainable. Even the dead silence was probably a period between the songbirds going to sleep for the night and the nocturnal animals coming out. All the rest, I think, was just in my head. That's why I think it was a good idea to leave the food as a sacrifice. It was like a placebo, a fantasy solution to a fantasy problem that worked to calm myself down. But even so, I've never been back to that stretch of woods, and I won't ever go there again. I can never be 100% sure there was truly nothing out there. I don't ever want to have an experience like that again. If there is something not quite right with that area, I don't want to find out what it is.